Thank you so much, Tiffany. And Pamela, thank you for joining us. It's wonderful to have an opportunity to talk with folks about the work that we've been doing as teachers at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. My name is Marty Eads, and I teach English in our Department of Language and Literature. And my colleague James Richardson teaches in our music department. And we have just completed our third year of teaching a fall senior seminar at EMU in which we use The World Made Straight as our primary text. And today we'd like to talk with you about how teaching The World Made Straight has given us opportunities that we hadn't anticipated to work at discussing matters of racial justice on our campus and beyond. Set in a racially homogenous Appalachian community in 1978, the book might not be an obvious choice as a point of entry into these kinds of conversations, but roundabout routes can sometimes be more rewarding than direct ones. And in this case, we're finding that our students' distance, both in location and over time, from the books, characters, personal, and historic traumas sometimes enables us to approach our own contemporary traumas in a way that seems to feel less threatening than a more obviously timely novel might. And the sample lecture that James will offer after my introductory remarks demonstrates the way in which the two of us keep discovering new depths in Rash's understanding of race in America. Now, I first became aware of Ron Rash when I was visiting my hometown of Boone, North Carolina, and visited the bookstore that had moved into the furniture store my dad had owned for 44 years. After my dad retired, we were so happy that a bookstore moved into that space. And so I went in one day to browse, and I found a stack of Rash's books, and I picked up The World Made Straight, looked at the back cover, and thought, oh no, this is not for me. This is too violent. But a few years later, I got an invitation to moderate a panel at the MLA on Appalachian fiction. And one of the presenters was speaking on Nothing Gold Could Stay. So I thought I better do my homework and read this book, and fell in love with Rash's short stories in that collection, and eventually developed the courage to go on and read The World Made Straight. And I found it such a compelling novel. It deals with theological issues that are of interest to me. The use of music is beautiful. The characterizations are rich. And as someone who grew up in that part of the world, Western North Carolina, I was just intrigued by Rash's sensitive handling of the complex loyalties of mountain people during the U.S. Civil War and since. So a few years later, I did a research project presentation at the ASA at Shepherd University. This was in 2016, entitled Not Just Whistling Dixie, that looked at the treatment of the character Travis's um, Confederate flag on his shirt as an emblem within the novel that connected it or helped anticipate some of the conversations going on about memorial monuments in the United States. And every time I came back around to the book, I just found something new. And the music was so interesting to me that I got in touch with James, and who found the book just as interesting as I have. And of course, he saw a lot in it that I didn't even recognize because of his training and interests. And our shared fascination with music and the novel, as well as our shared interest in eschatology or theological last things, prompted us to develop a proposal for a team talk course. And so the novel's title, The World Made Straight, is an allusion to a passage in the book of Isaiah, where the Bible talks about the rough places being made straight and the crooked plain, a vision of a world that's been repaired. And Handel uses that same biblical passage in Messiah, and Ron Rash then alludes to it both in his title and refers to it in the characters listening to Handel's Messiah. So as you can imagine, there was just a lot for us to unpack. Now, these interdisciplinary senior seminars at EMU are not conventionally theological. Our university is church related. We're owned by the Mennonite Church, but one of the goals of this class, or a primary goal of the class, is just to help seniors begin reflecting on their previous 4 years and how that will provide them with a launch pad for pursuing their vocations. But James and I really think of vocation as potentially a sense of calling from God to help make a crooked world more straight. And so we thought that we wanted to challenge our students to think in theological terms, even though they're not, we don't have a majority who are Mennonite. Lots of our students come from different Christian traditions. Some come from other religious traditions or don't identify as religious at all. So we want to make this invitational, and the book allows us to introduce these themes that are so important to us. So you can see here from our class syllabus page, and we call our class Stairways to Heaven, that we're looking at music, literature, and meaning, and related questions with aesthetics and ethics and theology. And we want our class to be experiential. So in addition to more conventional discussions and mini lectures on literature and music, we also have students do presentations on their interviews with local professionals in our area in their intended fields who speak about their view of setting the world straight or making life better. We also have students develop an arts project over the course of the semester. So maybe a musical composition or a selection of poetry, or even a recipe that they prepare and share for the class. We want them to let us have just a little taste of heaven as they imagine it, even if their conception isn't spiritual in any way. But we talk about the book's two protagonists, the World Made Straight's protagonists, high school dropout Travis and a former high school history teacher named Leonard. And both of these characters have really lost their way. They wouldn't really seem like vocational role models at first. But we talk with the students, or the students just see how in receiving Travis as a student of sorts and an unofficial foster son, Leonard renews and deepens his life calling in a way that proves to be a blessing for him, for Travis, and for Dina, another character in the book. So these characters' world is very broken, as broken as the characters they are, and they try in vain throughout the novel to sort of orient themselves and to comfort themselves through various forms of self-medication, including use of drugs, and sometimes objectifying sex, and listening to music that isn't always life-giving in the way that they approach it. So James and I want to invite our students to reflect on the brokenness of our world and the ways that we sometimes try to self-medicate, and to reflect on how we might adopt more life-giving practices and engagement with the material world, as well as to think about how our longings for a world made straight might lead us to our vocations. So in addition to the experiential components of the interviewing and the art project and the presentation, we also wanted to have a field trip. And our initial plan was to take our students to a battlefield site. Located as we are in the Shenandoah Valley, we have lots of options. But a conversation I had with another of our colleagues, Joanna Turner, who teaches in the Center for Justice and Peace Building, convinced me that we needed to do something different. Johanna said, "Why don't you take your students to Corhaven Slave Cemetery, which is in Quicksburg, Virginia? It's a beautiful retreat setting that honors the lives of a number of enslaved individuals whose graves were not marked. And the retreat community there have done research to honor these individuals, and they invite pilgrims to come and reflect on the experiences of our past. And although our thought of going to a battlefield seemed to be a good companion to the passage in The World Made Straight in which Travis and Leonard go to a neighbor-on-neighbor massacre site from the Civil War era, we have found that this Corhaven visit enables us to talk about underlying issues of the antebellum and Civil War context for the novel. Because even though the novel doesn't have African American characters, the characters don't talk about enslavement or a lot of the issues that are still reverberating through our culture, they are there underneath the surface, and students are eager to talk about them. But I think sometimes they feel sort of relieved that we aren't reading just another book about obviously contemporary issues. So in our first two visits to Corhaven, we found that we did have much to talk about around our country's legacy of enslavement and its aftermath. And the coordinator at Corhaven, Sarah Kors, is a wonderful guide to some of this information. And Sarah also invites students to engage in artistic practice while they're at Corhaven. And you'll see in the next slide our students doing some of this work. You can see she provides little bins of paints and markers and paper. Some students write poems, and we share our poems. And you see on the lower left, James preparing to lead us in singing Amazing Grace. Sarah's husband greets us upon arrival by playing Amazing Grace on the bagpipes. And we talk a little bit about John Newton, the author of Amazing Grace, as someone who had been involved in the slave trade and repented of that. But this past year, we weren't able to take field trips because of Corhaven. I mean, because of COVID. We weren't able to go to Corhaven, but we certainly had experiences on campus that fed into this stream of conversation about race and racial injustice. And chief among those experiences was the painting of a Black Lives Matter mural on our campus and subsequent conversation about how that was handled. And students in our class who were involved with the creation of the mural shared pretty freely about the disappointment that they had experienced, that not everyone's reception of the mural was positive. Also in the class this year was everybody's awareness of the upcoming election. And on a few occasions during Zoom sessions, we saw political posters in the backgrounds of our students' rooms. And so that fed at times into the tension that we were all experiencing because of what was going on around us. But the book was a through line for considering how we might approach historic and personal trauma and the ways that we try to deal with it. So with all of this information as context, I invite you to enjoy with me a presentation that James originally developed to highlight the intersections of drugs, sex, and rock and roll in this novel, but has increasingly become about matters of race as well.
So round about the 3/4 mark of the semester, we get to the point, kind of a penultimate point in The World Made Straight that touches on these topics. And as Marty already explained, as a musician, I'm thoroughly intrigued by Rash's novel. As an author, he gives a very unique soundtrack via musical selections that are generated and heard by the characters within the context of the story. In film music, we call this diegetic music because it's taking place in the context of the character's story, as opposed to underscoring some sweeping abstract soundtrack outside of it all. These musical excerpts are seamlessly integrated into Rash's skillful prose in a way that they both mirror and actually create the ethos of a particular scene. And Marty already referenced, at the heart of the story, Rash explores ideas of redemption and reconciliation, while Leonard, a drug dealer who lives in, Rash writes, a roachy old trailer, plays, of all things, a record of George Frederick Handel's 1741 choral work, The Messiah. Whether you know this work or not, you actually probably do. Maybe it's as simple as you're hearing the Hallelujah chorus when you're shopping at Christmas time, wafting through the halls the same way secondhand smoke used to in the airport. It's a cultural lexicon, the Hallelujah chorus. And it's this beautiful juxtaposition. Leonard marvels, this is the drug dealer Leonard, and this is a quotation from the book. He marvels at the wonder of it, the balance of the thing, everything countered, not just balanced, but reconciled as the tenor voices resonated below the ethereal sopranos. Even the words proclaimed an order, the crookedness of the world made straight. And the italics, the emphasis there is Rash's, not mine. I think the integration of music, I mean, it's so thorough, I could almost use this quotation in the context of teaching my music theory students. Elsewhere, Aaron Copland's Appalachian Spring Ballet is used as a link to understanding or the concept of empathy. And bear with me just a moment here. All right, so I am not used to Teams, so not quite as fluid there. In chapter 13 of 15 chapters, the story's tone takes a dramatic turn from these noble themes from Messiah and Appalachian Spring. Up to this point, our 17-year-old Travis, Travis Shelton, who Marty introduced us to, he comes from an economically depressed Southern Appalachian community where our story takes place. He has done much to put himself on the straight and narrow, on the positive path. Despite continued wrestling with the effects of personal and historic trauma, Travis has rallied to complete his high school GED. And yet, here in the novel, that accomplishment doesn't satiate in the way that he had expected. Rather, it's accompanied by a number of triggers that propel him to self-medicate. Rash writes at the end of chapter 12, he hadn't smoked a cigarette in months, but his mouth and lungs ached for one now. Bum, 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 ba. It's the hook that keeps us reading to the next chapter, and it's the foreshadowing of, even though it's just smoking, here's some self-addictive behaviors that will escalate. When his celebratory evening, a special date with his girlfriend Lori, doesn't go as he had hoped, everything escalates. On their way back to her home, Travis parked in the same place where they had first kissed, hoping for something at this point more than just a kiss. Rash says they parked, quote, facing where the land broke off, opening to a deep, far fall. It's a beautiful place, but I think Rash is literally with his writing putting us on edge, and it's clear what Travis has on his mind. Lori gives Travis a gift, a silver cross necklace, and it would have involved much thought and resources on her part to describe Lori's circumstances as economically depressed probably isn't stating things as severely as they could, as things could be or described. Travis doesn't thank her. Instead, he quips, "You got anything else for me?" Rash writes, she kissed him, letting her tongue find his. "More than that," Travis said, and cupped his hand on her breast. Lori didn't move his hand this time. She made a soft sound deep in her throat as he kissed her harder. It was only when he placed his hand on her inner thigh that she tensed and pushed him away. "Now don't get rowdy and ruin a good night for us, boy." Lori said, her hand straightening her dress. It's been ruined already, Travis replied. And an argument, one of several arguments here, ensues. Why are you so mad at me? Lori asked. I was just trying to make tonight special for you. Travis cranked the engine and pulled back onto the hardtop. He drove fast, and when Lori told him to slow down, he ignored her. He went off the road, onto the shoulder, gravel spraying behind them like shrapnel. Lori began crying, and he drove even faster. When they got to her house, he kept the motor running as she got out and ran inside. He jerked the chain off his neck and threw it out the window. And I think there's a bit of messianic symbolism there in his rejection of this cross. And I always go off on a long tangent, having two daughters, to my students, our students, and talk about if they ever treat a girl that way. Just like Travis is speeding, the tempo, the rhythm, the cadence of the novel picks up. It intensifies. And to use translated terms that the Kaluli tribe of Papua New Guinea uses as a way of thinking about music, and this may seem kind of esoteric, but when I studied this tribe in an ethnomusicology course as a master's student, it completely changed the way I think about music. They talk about when music intensifies, when it crescendos, when it builds in a number of ways. It's hardening is the word translated that they use. And so this book at this point hardens. So does Rash's soundtrack. And if you think about it, this language is not that radical. It's very much a part of our lexicon. We talk about soft music, soft rock music, or hard rock. We use language like hardcore, and there are certainly sexual overtones to this kind of vocabulary. Hard rock, or musical hardening, has been called cock rock for its overt masculinity and sexuality. And at this point, maybe the students in our class are blushing a little bit, and maybe they think I'm going down a perverted path. And I used to try to say, remember the Christopher Guest film, This is Spinal Tap? And I hope maybe some of you have seen this, but no one seems to know that film anymore. But it makes fun of some of these tropes of hard rock music. Furthermore, in our teaching this course in the present day, it has become increasingly apparent that this kind of testosterone-fueled hardening, centered around an aggrieved Travis and to a certain degree Leonard, has everything to do with poor, marginalized Southern white men who subsequently embrace an insurgent identity. That may feel like fighting words, but I invite you to keep listening as I'll parse that out. Ultimately, returning to the story, after dropping off Lori, Travis's aimless, self-destructive evening involves his connecting with old friends and their quest to score more than just the beers that they had been downing. They're out to land some hardcore drugs. On their drive to the drug dealer, not Leonard. This is a more kind of evil in the context of the novel, though complicated character that they're traveling to, whose name is suddenly escaping me. Toomey is his last name. On their drive, Travis's friend, quote, Shank, turned right at the next stop sign, and soon they crossed over the French Broad. Wesley shoved an Allman Brothers tape into the player, and as Marty mentioned, this takes place in the late 70s, and turned up the volume, the speakers on the panel behind Travis's head. All four windows were down. The Plymouth's headlights swept the trees on each curve, darkness regathering, closing behind them as though where they'd once been was forever gone. Maybe it is, Travis thought. And if that's so, the hell with it. He drank the second beer slower, felt the alcohol start to glow inside him. The music that had hurt his ears now seems not loud enough, and he shouted as much to Shank, who turned the volume up until the speakers shook. Travis leaned his head against the speakers. The opening bass lines of Whipping Post surged through his body. He thought about his father and how he hoped the bastard really was behind in his farm work, because then the old man would realize how much Travis had done during spring planting. He imagined his father begging him to come back to the farm and help him get the planting done. Travis telling the old man to kiss his ass. He'd tell Lori the same thing if she called. Tell her there were other girls he knew for a fact would put out. One of the cashiers had been flirting with him for weeks. Knew as well she wouldn't be telling him how to live every moment of his life. And I should mention part of this literary hardening that I'm talking about involves Rash's increasingly abrasive language. There's a lot of banter amongst this circle of guys about Travis's blue balls and so forth. And I really hope that I'm not, if you've not read the novel, putting you off to it, because Rash's writing is beautiful. And here, this is just uh, somewhat taken out of context of his beautiful picture, a landscape of Appalachia, complete with another character, is very much the flora and fauna. But I think even here, there's a beauty in Rash's technique. A few paragraphs later, Travis closed his eyes and let the music and the alcohol completely envelop him. It was like being inside a watery cocoon. When the Allman Brothers tape ended, Travis leaned forward. Put in the Skinner tape and forward it to Freebird, Travis said, and get me another beer. Sociologist and rock music historian Roy Schuker likens this kind of long, drawn-out jam session that accompanies ballads such as the ones in the novel here, Whipping Post and Freebird. He likens them to sexual orgasms, the way that they artfully build, the way that they're paced, the way that gratification is delayed, the way the musically expected is replaced with the musically unexpected. Chord progressions and tempo changes. There's musical tension that is constantly building towards resolution, and a good singer-songwriter, a good composer, a good author toys with the idea of resolution. And whether you recognize yourself as a musician or not, we all have a certain innate kind of expectations. Da 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 dee da dee, ba da 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 dee da dum. Inside, you're desperately wanting that to resolve to bum da 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 dee. Maybe you don't think about that consciously, but on a certain level, even if you don't, uh, it leaves you unsettled. And that's an oversimplification of what's happening on a macro scale when musicians are toying with our expectations. The Allman Brothers and Leonard Skinner are two bands that both originated in 1969 and are now considered beacons of Southern rock, uh, a style, and again, another oversimplification, but a style that combines blues and rock with a slight hint of country twang, placing emphasis, like a lot of rock music, on the guitars and the vocals. Here is a picture of the Allman Brothers. The Allman Brothers were Dwayne Allman, there in the bottom left with the reddish hair, who had played guitar with Eric Clapton. So he was the real thing. And then his brother, Greg, who looks a lot like him with the blonde hair right next to him, who was behind the vocals, the keyboards, and the songwriting. And there's also here another lead guitarist, a bass guitarist, two drummers. Dwayne by far was the biggest star with his virtuosic guitar playing. And I say this somewhat facetiously, like all great rock artists, he died young. At the peak of his career, he was just shy of turning 25 when he died in a motorcycle accident in Georgia, I think is where it was. Though Greg, his brother, had already written Whipping Post and they'd recorded it in an earlier album, it was their legendary live recording in Manhattan at Fillmore East with an extended jam session, something like 23 minutes long, that took up the whole B side of another album and is what has entered into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Rolling Stone describes it, Whipping Post, as an enduring anthem rife with tormented blues ballad imagery. The song's lyrics center on a metaphorical whipping post, an evil woman, and futile existential sorrow. And this ballad, it builds to a series of, I think of them as these shrieking lead guitar statements, and it reaches its full strength in this kind of chorus of not one but two, or a duet of lead guitars. Another rock critic, Donald Brown, describes Dwayne's virtuosic guitar flourishes as, quote, fiery lacerations of the flesh. It's a fitting, though troubling, description given the song's lyrics and this metaphor, and this year of all years, of a whipping post. Here are the lyrics, and like a good kind of blues ballad, there's repetition, and with repetition comes greater emphasis. Sometimes I feel like I've been tied to the whipping post, tied to the whipping post, tied to the whipping post. Good Lord, I feel like I'm dying. It is an interesting irony that in many cases, Southern rock bands held progressive political and cultural views. Their inspiration was Black music, not the lily white surfing music of the same time coming from California, not the Beach Boys. In many respects, their music was much more progressive. J-Mo Johansson, one of the Allman Brothers drummers, was an African American, but despite all this, they couldn't divorce themselves from the prejudices of the South. That was more poignant when Marty and I taught this course and when I last gave this lecture to our students. Anyway, it's the song's unique bass line that Ron Rash highlights in his kind of quasi music theory textbook here. Here it is. And whether you read music or not, you will notice a number of 11 at the beginning of these segments, these measures. The beats are grouped into a pattern of 11, which is an anomaly in music. Typically, we have patterns of 2 or 3. Here, however, there's 11. Sometimes we'll have patterns of 5 and 7 as well. And so it makes us take note. And I'll come back and describe why it makes us take note. But to hear this, bum ba da 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 dum ba da 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 dum ba da 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 bum 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 ba da 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 dum ba da 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 dum ba da 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 bum bum. That may help you as I read this next quotation. An interview with Greg. I didn't know the intro was in 11/8 time. I just saw it as 3 sets of 3 and then 2 to jump on the next 3 sets with. It was like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. I didn't count it as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It was 1 beat short, but it didn't feel 1 short because to get back to the triad, you had 2 steps to go up. You'd really hit those 2 hard to accent them. He's talking about the bum, bum, 1, 2. So that would separate the 3s. Dwayne said, "That's good, man. I didn't know that you understood 11/8. Of course, I said something intelligent like, what's 11/8? Dwayne just said, okay, dumbass, I'll try to draw it up on paper for you. If the 60s psychedelia was fueled by hallucinogenic drugs like LSD, then perhaps Southern rock's drug of choice is Jim Beam. Regardless, I would suggest this bass line repeated over and over again and then manipulated as it is in Whipping Post is all part of the song's drug euphoria escalating frenzy. There is something about the fact that this is grouped into patterns of 11 which makes it become a vicious cycle that cannot end. For it to feel complete, it should be grouped by beats into a pattern of 12. So therefore, it constantly propels itself forward. Bum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da, bum, bum, cannot end there. It has to go back to the downbeat, which is really functioning as the beginning beat of the next measure, but the conclusion. So you've got overlapping kind of patterns. Dun da 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 dun da 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 dun da 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 bum 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 ba da 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 dum ba da 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 dum ba da 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 bum bum bum. It wants to keep going. So I'll stop performing this for you. We'll actually listen to some of that. And apologies because I'm getting a notice that my computer has stopped sharing sound. So I'll have to log out of the presentation and log back in and hope that the video will work for you. All right, we'll listen to just a few minutes, which is not fair because this is quite a long track, but you'll get a sense of the soundscape of Rash's The World Made Straight at this moment. It is hard to stop because it's somewhat infectious. It's uh, anyway. Though these may be fighting words, I cannot help but compare this kind of energy to the misguided euphoria or emotionally heightened mob mentality of the rioters, of the extremists at the US Capitol. And that is arguably in the music. It is a theme that Jason Eastman from Coastal Carolina University explored in his 2011 article, which really I find incredibly prophetic. Rebel Manhood, the hegemonic masculinity of the Southern rock music revival. He writes, I find marginalized men embrace a Southern rebel identity to meet hegemonic masculine ideals shared across social classes and geographic regions. Rebels reject the middle class roles and cultural capital most men use to signify their manhood by accruing authority and resources through education, career, and family. Instead, Southern rebels empower the masculine self by protesting authority figures, dominating women, and signifying their independence by drinking, using drugs, and brawling. And I know it's not very fair to go straight from the brilliance of something progressive like the Allman Brothers to this quotation and this comparison, agree or disagree. There's something here, and certainly at this particular moment in the novel, that quotation describes Travis's current behavior to a T. The music itself acts as a kind of dopamine release just as potent as a mob or any other high. Martha hooked me on Ron Rash when several years ago, and she pointed this out earlier. She gave an entire lecture concerning music as a means of self-medicating by the characters specifically in this novel, and she also looked at other literature as well. And part of her research delved into this growing cross-disciplinary field, neuromusicology. And her thesis has largely inspired and shaped our collective ideas, including the ones I'm presenting right now as it concerns music in the novel. In The Neuroscience of Music, author Jonah Lehrer writes, when listening to our favorite songs, our body betrays all the symptoms of emotional arousal. The pupils in our eyes dilate, our pulse and blood pressure rise, the electrical conductance of our skin is lowered, and the cerebellum, a brain region associated with bodily movement, becomes strangely active. Blood is even redirected to the muscles in our legs. Some speculate that is why we begin tapping our feet. Furthermore, the brain releases dopamine that coincides with the musical climax of your favorite piece of music or your favorite parts of that music. Continuing, it doesn't matter if we're having sex or snorting cocaine or listening to Kanye. These things fill us with bliss because they tickle these cells. I think it's really interesting that Ron Rash would put back to back the songs Whipping Post and Freebird, because even the titles alone suggest a kind of contrast. Whipping Post is very grounded with its earthy bass. In terms of the lyrics, the protagonist is constrained. Leonard Skinner, Freebird, is attempting to break the confines of this earth with ascending guitar lines. In terms of its lyrics, it's concerned with freedom. I know this image of the band here seems like something straight out of Saturday Night Live. I can't help but think of the Christopher Walken, Will Ferrell bit, "Guys, I need more cowbell," as this is exactly the kind of trope that is being spoofed in that sketch, if you know it. Continuing back to the novel, reading, Travis opens the can and took a long drink, then leaned back and listened to Gary Rossington's slide guitar. He knew musicians called their guitars axes, and now Travis thought he understood why, because the guitar's hard, sharp notes seemed to split open his skull so that the music could pour in and wash everything else out of his head. When Ronnie Van Zant began singing, Travis sang along. It was like the lyrics had been written just for how he felt this night. Or perhaps it was like the author had the intelligent wherewithal to use this as part of his soundtrack. It's very apropos. Those lyrics read, "Because I'm free as a bird now, and this bird you cannot change. Lord knows I can't change. Lord help me, I can't change. Lord, I can't change." Uh, I think there's an irony because to me, that doesn't sound quite like freedom. You may know the song, or perhaps you know the band's other signature piece, Sweet Home Alabama. At the peak of their success, lead vocalist, songwriter, and band founder Ronnie Van Zant and lead guitarist Steve Gaines and backup singer his sister Casey Gaines all died in an airplane crash in 1977. Uh, this is spoofed if you've ever seen that Cameron Crowe, somewhat autobiographical pick movie, Almost Famous, which really is chronicling his experience with the Allman Brothers. But as I said before, great rock artists, they have to die young. Before that, they gave us the legendary song Freebird. Interestingly, it was originally intended as a tribute to the deceased Duane Allman. And on the album recording, you actually hear this organ, which retrospectively we realize is a nod to a funeral. It's a funeral organ. In terms of harmonic progression, everything about Freebird is pretty straightforward. I don't mean to take away from its genius because it's pretty predictable, but it's that predictability that opens the door for these kind of drug-like improvisations. If the Allman Brothers were progressive by having two lead guitars, then you'd have to suggest Leonard Skinner's approach is like the Allman Brothers on steroids. By song's end, the free bird is indeed trying to break free via these triple guitar attacks that explode into the stratosphere. And even if you don't read music, you can see, just thinking about this musical staff like a graph, that it's over the long haul ascending, getting higher, trying to break free from the staff even. I'll play for you some of Freebird, but a trigger warning here. Leonard Skinner regularly performed against the backdrop of the Confederate flag, something for which the surviving members have since explained and even apologized. And now they use, the remnant of the band that still performs uses an American flag. Uh, Anyway, uh, I can't help but draw your attention to another and earlier article by Jason Eastman from 2008, also prophetic. Southern rock musicians, he writes, Southern rock musicians' construction of white trash. I'm sorry, that's the title of the article. He and several colleagues suggest the degradation of poor Southern whites resulted in musicians reclaiming what they view as positive attributes of white trash. They do this by embracing symbols of Southern white trash, including the Confederate flag, glorifying rural poverty, and celebrating drunken violence. And again, I say these things wanting to be sensitive. I don't mean to tarnish your enjoyment of these exceptional ballads, which I love, but to make you aware of the sociological context in which we find ourselves teaching this novel in this particular academic year. It's always been uncomfortable to show this video of Leonard Skinner and the Confederate flag, but each year it's more and more a hot button. And I am being told again that my sound has toggled out, so bear with me yet again. Thank you. And now we'll listen to a little bit segments of Freebird. In music, when we have the music portraying an idea quite concretely, we call it text painting. And right here, we've got text painting. The guitar is indeed a bird. We hear bird calls in the guitar right there.
If I leave here tomorrow, would you still remember me? I must be traveling on now, 'cause there's too many places I've got to see. If I stay with you, girl, things just couldn't be the same. 'Cause I'm as free as a bird. I swear I am. Can I change?
And the verse repeats. I'm going to skip to where some of the improvisation begins. one of the things that I marvel at is when a musician is able to sustain a high level of energy that's begun here, yet for another 5 minutes or so. And so I will skip now towards the end. And like any epic or big story, think Lord of the Rings, books or films, you have to have several endings. And in essence, that's what's happening at the end of this jam session. Notice the delayed cadences, cadence meaning ending in music, the delayed musical endings. The conclusion here is drawn out. It would seem we're done. Just kidding.
One of the great ones, Leonard Skinner. Let's hear it for them. Man, that band's so good, you'd think they were from San Francisco, would you?
I always have to play that to the end so you can get the last doobie there. Again, there's something about milking out, making the high, making the orgasm last, things escalating, things hardening, that I think is every bit in Rash's prose as well. Something here, however, about Leonard Skinner's ranting and then musical ranting, I'm as free as a bird, doesn't really convince me. The lady doth protest too much, methinks. Travis's rejection of Laurie, Travis's rejection of the messianic cross, which he threw out the window, offers a very bleak interpretation of freedom. I can't change as a mantra. It's more a picture of brokenness, which Marty was talking about, and we're left wondering how this crooked, off-kilter world, to use Rash's own language, will be made straight. Where's that reconciliation Rash introduced earlier in the novel? And now I'll hand things, yes, back over to my colleague, Martha.
Thank you so much, James. So where does this leave us? We've got an echo here. Can y'all advise me? Maybe it's okay now. So where does this leave us? As James has so eloquently demonstrated, the world made straight does leave us with many unanswered questions. The world Travis has experienced as off-kilter early in the novel is in some ways more so as the book ends. And when I think theologically about this work of literary art, I'm reminded of an essay another of our colleagues, Peter Dula from our Bible and Religion department, wrote about Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. In exploring the claim that the arc of history in an obviously broken world bends toward justice, Peter Dula quotes James Baldwin, who said, "The purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers." Peter Dula observes, "It is also the purpose of theology. The arc of history doesn't exist. The arc of God's purpose does, and it bends toward justice. But justice is an abstraction. We can be more precise. The arc of God's purposes in history bends toward the cross." That sounds like an answer, but it is an answer that lays bare a host of questions. How is that justice? How does that fulfill the promises that pervade the Old Testament? Shall we understand those promises to have been revealed as metaphors for the cross? And if so, shouldn't we also think of the second coming as equally metaphorical, but of a mystery that we cannot understand, rather than a future firmly fixed in our intellectual grasp? The World Made Straight does not, of course, answer these kinds of questions, but it does help us consider them with our students. And having Leonard reflect on Handel's Messiah at the novel's center, and again at his point of greatest tension near the novel's end, in taking the book's title from a biblical passage at the heart of Messiah, and in having the final scene of the novel be Travis' decision to pursue reconciliation with Lori, who'd given him the cross necklace, Rash seems to be suggesting the same thing, that the arc of God's purposes bends toward the cross. Rash doesn't provide the happy ending we might want. Instead, he dares us to hope that Travis and Lori, and maybe even we readers, can participate somehow in setting the world straight. And when I dared to send him a copy of the Whistling Dixie essay in which I first asserted that the world made straight ultimately points to Christ's redemptive power, Rash thrilled me with his email response. "Dear Marty," he wrote, "thanks so much for understanding the book's true core. Ron, who is among the believers." James and I therefore feel justified in using the World Made Straight in this way to explore with students the degree to which the cross might serve as a reference point for every sort of justice, including racial justice. Now, however, after a Capitol storming in which invaders carried not only Confederate flags, but also symbols of Christian faith, our challenge as teachers in this course is going to be greater than ever. So we welcome your thoughts about how best to move forward, even as we share with you this account of gratitude for the work Rash's powerful novel has already enabled us to do. Thank you. So does anybody have any questions or comments? We would love to hear them.
I'm interested how you're going to approach this after, after the events that you just referenced on the 6th. And, where does the discussion go when you're using this book and talking about, because the Confederate flag shirt part of the book is something that I always talk about with students, because I always really appreciated how Leonard, kind of cut him a little bit about that, and, which is not what people I think would expect when they're reading about, people in this part of the country. So I'm curious as where you'll go from here.
Yeah,
James.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'll let you jump in, but it's interesting because, you know, some of these insights, the January 6th obviously happened after last semester. So, yeah, I think it'll just have to be front and center. And I don't know, Marty, it seems like we might even just have to build in a day that is just focused on these racial tensions for a whole session, maybe before we do the Core Haven graveyard. I don't know.
I think we could introduce a few other short stories in which Rash addresses race more explicitly, like Overtime, and the one, and Tiffany, you might be able to recall the title more easily than I am right now. The one about the men who are traveling through the mountains from their enslaved situation, and they're hiding on a farm in Blowing Rock. And it's evident that the younger of the two has been the son of the plantation owner, and the man who finds them hiding in his barn lets the older one go. Do you remember that story?
I just don't remember that one.
Oh, it's awesome. I mean, it's really haunting because the white man who owns the barn where these two escaping enslavement obviously picks up on the fact that the younger man, who's supposedly the son of the older fleeing man, was really the son of the enslaver. And there's this resentment that he's able to detect in the father. And he's the guy who owns the barn has lost a son on the battlefield, and he says, let's just trade. And so I'm going to keep this younger guy here, and you can keep moving north or west. Anyway, there are, you know, Ron Rash does have a few stories that deal more explicitly with race, but I thought it was kind of refreshing, as I tried to say in the introduction of this presentation, that we're not dealing directly with texts about racial trauma, because students are so confronted with that, you know, in the news, in their own lives. So I've kind of liked that this book lets us approach it from the back door.
I think it will be an interesting conversation when you relate the two. I have a hard time with the Confederate flag because I often have students, you know, asking about why is this a symbol, and you know, especially we're being so close to West Virginia, they're like, but West Virginia is West Virginia because they were against the Confederacy, and now, you know, it's like this symbol, and I struggle continuously with that question, and I don't know how to respond to people, honestly. So I appreciate that Rash used that reference in the book, but I still don't know how to approach it with students, honestly.
I wonder if that article James cited by the guy at Coastal Carolina would help. You know, you don't want to offend the people in your class who do
Right.
fly the flag, or you want to be gently challenging rather than insulting, which they might perceive some of the language in that. Do you think they would, James? Or
Yeah, I don't know. It's an irony that perhaps what the very article is pointing out might make someone feel more marginalized if they're already there. And Marty and I have discussed back and forth, you know, beyond the Confederate flag, it's interesting how certain political symbols have now become these kind of icons in the same vein, which is, you know, more a challenge when we have just diverse students with political views diverse.
Yeah, I made a note about it was the Jason Eastman article, right? What was the name of that article?
Yeah,
I
I'll
don't
tell
put
you.
you on the spot, but I wanted to reference that.
Tiffany, I'll put a link to the article where I first worked with this in the chat in case you're curious.
Yeah, that would be great.
And I wonder if telling our own stories around the Confederate flag would be helpful. You know, I'm really interested in the work David French is doing right now about how when people shift on a topic like this, they risk losing their entire support group, their entire identity group. But when we hear stories, we can begin to understand the impact or the pain. And I have a story from my own family's conflicted relationship to the flag that, you know, doesn't involve as much pain as it would for a lot of other folks, but it could be a point of entry.
It's hard to, you know, I find myself in a position where it's hard sometimes to defend, you know, Appalachian people, you know, when this is a symbol for a lot of them. I struggle with it, and students are like, but how can you be so, you know, passionate about this region when so many people engage in behavior that is not what I believe in? And so I find myself, you know, in a awkward position sometimes with that.
You know, Trump, I'm sorry, go ahead, James, go ahead.
No, I'm interrupting. I can't even find where we chat. That's how, in order to send the article to you.
Up at the top, there's a conversation bubble. But James, I had the hardest time finding it too. I wanted to send you some encouraging private messages saying you're handling the text so well. And I couldn't find it for the longest time. I'll Google it if you want to tell me that. Let's see. The author's name was Jason.
Sorry, it's Jason Eastman, spelled just as it sounds. The article is Rebel Manhood.
Rebel Manhood.
The Hegemonic Masculinity of the Southern Rock Music Revival.
Somebody put a kind word in the chat to us, James. Pamela, thank you. Thanks so much for coming and for the encouragement. If you have thoughts afterward, email us, please.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to do that. I have to jump off because I'm producing the next session at 10, that starts at 10:30, and I have to get on that one. But I very much enjoyed your presentation, and I have a hard time finding people that have read this book, honestly, sometimes. So it's nice to hear other people who love it as much as I do. So I think you're doing great work, and I'm probably gonna reach out to you both at some point in the future. So
thanks so much.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Tiffany.
Bye.
Bye, Pamela.